We're on the air. Good morning, everyone. We'll call the Special Assessments Task Force meeting to order. And first item on the agenda will be approval of the minutes. Everyone had a chance to look at the minutes?
I'll make a motion to approve.
And any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
Carries. We will do roll call next. Should have done that first. My apologies. Go ahead and take the roll, Diana.
Bullis. Busick. Cosgrove.
Here.
Dabbert. Dardis.
Here.
Fremsted.
Present.
Gehrig.
Here.
Gorosky.
Here.
Grinberg.
Here.
Hanson.
Here.
Palm.
Here.
Volk.
Here.
Worth.
Here.
Thank you. I did have texts from Mr. Dabbert and Mr. Bullis this morning that unfortunately their schedules changed and they couldn't make it this morning. So I did hear from those two. So a review of our agenda from our prior meeting, discussion centered around a 5-year look back and then a 5-year CIP plan looking into the future. That'll be led by Brenda Derrick here shortly. And then Mr. Grubb is going to give us a wrap up of the legislation that it has impact, what if it impact on the topic of special assessments. And then before you is the survey, a summary of that survey that we reviewed last time. And the hope there is to get consensus on what your recommendations are as a next step. And then we would like to proceed with some community forums to take that information and share with the public. 2 or 3 forums in May and early June to get their feedback, and then bring that back to the task force one last time in June for your final recommendations based on citizen input. And then Commissioner Gehrig and the rest of us would hear at City Commission level the list of recommendations by the end of June for our budgeting process and moving forward is a plan. So if that, throughout this morning, if that feels right and something you want to continue with us doing as staff, particularly with the presentations, any changes to that, let us know before we adjourn today. And then we'll add some comments from Bernie Dardis on West Fargo's actions and plan with specials, and then ask for public comment towards the end of our meeting today. Does that seem a good step? Okay, that's how we'll proceed. Brenda. Good morning.
Good morning. So today I'm here to kind of go over what we presented a little bit last year on our 2019 CIP, and then do some look backs and some comparisons and look forwards. So here is the 2019 CIP that was presented to the City Commission last fall and approved. This one does not include any water main replacement projects. As with the switch back to the 2013 policy, we did cut out the water main replacement projects this year. We will start those again next year. And then these numbers also include our flood and new development projects. So some of the factors that we consider when determining which projects are part of the CIP is we actually have a survey that we do on our roads that give us our pavement condition index. We also have our water main break history. We look at our street light and traffic signal needs. We look at our flood control needs. And then we also coordinate with our other departments. So we're working with Public Works, we're working with planning, see what redevelopment is happening, and then also seeing what roads are causing Public Works to do more work than what they should be, and that we need to get in and replace those. So some of the tools we use is from our water main breaks, we're able to do some heat maps to kind of really pop out those areas that we need to get into. And here are a couple examples. And then Public Works keeps up a 12 worst map for us And we try and use that to combine with our work so that we can try and get some of those knocked off their list. So on our federal aid projects, these projects are set every 5 years by MetroCog. They do a long-range transportation plan that's approved by MetroCog and then moved to the different commission groups for approval. And so when they're working on their long-range transportation plan, each of the municipalities are addressing the roadways that we see in the future that we'd like to dedicate our federal monies to. So I wanted to talk a little bit also before we go into our look back and look forward on our arterial roadways. I know there's been a lot of discussion on those also, and what kind of cost participation we should have in those. And so one of the things I just wanted to kind of talk about is how we designate our roadways into an arterial status. And so those arterials are the streets that we rely on to move us throughout the city. And the city and MetroCog work with the North Dakota DOT on that designation. And the DOT does require an official map designating the collectors and arterials, as those are the streets that will be eligible for the federal aid. So as the federal aid gets distributed, there's typically not enough to support all of the arterial construction or reconstruction needs. And typically these are necessary due to either our city growth, roadway capacity issues, worn out infrastructure, water or sewer utility needs. And that's when we come in and do some funding with the assessments and sales tax. So in our original presentation last year, this is a 5-year look back, but this is with everything in it. It has the flood. It's our total approved CIP looking back for 5 years by the commission. So what we did to really look at what is special assessed, we came back and took out new developments, because new developments are completely 100% assessed. Alleyways, when we get a request for reconstructing an alley or turning it from gravel to paving, those are 100% assessed. And the flood projects are paid by the flood sales tax. So this is the 5-year CIP look back without the new development, alleys, and flood projects. And so you can kind of see that there isn't a whole lot of change in the numbers. They might go up a little bit and then they come back down. So at the last meeting, we talked a little bit about the special assessment look back. And so the 5-year special assessment look back. So in the first column, what you'll see is the reconstruction and rehabilitation projects, which include our water main replacement, street reconstruction, mill and overlay, seal coat projects. Those are our established projects. And so that, we did a 5-year, it's a 5-year look back, but we also included 2018 in those numbers. And so you get that average of about 15 million that we're special assessing out. Now there's another category also that is not local greenfields. So the next column is those non-local new development costs. So for instance, 52nd Avenue that we're currently doing today, or if we would, I'm trying to think, 45th Street as that extends down, those first costs of constructing the arterial roadways, those were not included in the first column. And so all of those more regional type costs, regional lift stations that would be for new developments, that would be assessed to something more than just that local cost. So the next column has those dollars that were special assessed in relationship to those projects. So in other words, the second column, the only thing that's not in it is local construction costs, greenfields. And then the third column is the alley paving, the value that we special assess annually for the alley paving. And then on the right, what you'll see is the annual total amount special assessed for each year. And I'm going to pause for a minute in case anyone has any specific questions on that one slide before I keep going,
Mr. Volk?
because I might have stumbled a little.
Thanks, Brenda. So if I understand right, this again is non-greenfield.
The second one is non-local greenfields. So we did take out like your sewer, water, storm sewer right in front of the new greenfield house. That is not in there.
What's the scale of that number? Special assessed projects that were assessed but aren't in here?
I don't, we did not pull that number. I can get that number and email it out.
Just curious to relativeness. Is it again as much, half, just a ballpark if you have a sense?
Yeah, again, it just varies so much on every year as far as what the request is and where we're at. So some years it might be 8 million and some it might be 20, 30 million. So it really does vary.
Kent?
Is this the amount that's assessed, or is this subject to the 50-50 split or the 70-30 split in which the city pays a portion?
So in that second column, there's a mix. So on the new regional storm lift ponds, stations, those are 100% assessed. But when you get to the arterials, even in new development, there's a cap.
So this is just the amount special assessed for those projects. There were also city funds that went into all these projects that are not shown here. This is just the value that was special assessed.
The question, Kent? No. Looking at your face, thought maybe you had another question.
Just doing the math.
Okay. Proceed.
So for our
That's a very
five-year
good
look ahead, this is without also new development, alleys, and floodways. So the flood projects, this is our rehabilitation, our water main replacement projects, storm rehabilitation projects, traffic signals. This is our proposed looking ahead. This is what we will be moving forward with, well, with the other ones added as we start moving ahead with our budget requests. And so the last slide I kind of wanted to do is a comparison. So on the top, what you'll see is our 5-year look back without the new development, alleys, and flood projects, and then the 5-year look ahead. And if you have any questions.
Jeff?
In the look ahead, is it too early to try to forecast how much of the work is needing to be special assessed? How far out can you start to see that picture?
So when you ask that question, are you asking on reconstruction projects or?
I'm thinking to try to compare it to your slide of how much was special assessed looking backwards. So it would, and I'm not seeing slide numbers on here, but it was the one you stopped. It shows 29.13 million average over the 5 years. So trying to compare that number to 74 million, 67 million looking out. How soon do you know what you think you need out of specials of that block of money that needs to be spread?
We do have that on the slideshow, and I can certainly pull that from what we've done. Part of the issue we have is that it's very high level until we know what the project is. So we do a preliminary estimate. We look at kind of averages of what we've typically special assessed for those projects. So really for that funding policy on say a street recon, we estimate about 25% of it is going to be special assessed, and the rest comes from sewer utility, water utility, and street sales tax funds. So we can do that, but we know that it's going to change as we get closer, actually define the project, get an engineer's estimate, and do that.
Christie, and then Bernie, and then Kurt.
I just have a question on the arterial funding. When we're looking ahead 5 years, isn't there a 5-year look ahead to apply for federal funding for that project?
Yeah, so we are programmed currently through 2022. So we do know what those projects are going to be. We know what's allocated for federal funds. And then we look at that cost split between what the special assessed cost and the sales tax would be. So again, we have a high level estimate on that looking forward. But until the project is actually, we get into design and better defined, they are pretty high level numbers.
So is every arterial project, do you apply for federal funding for each of them? And what determines which project gets federal funding compares to another one?
So a lot of times it's the scope. A more localized arterial might not require the federal aid like some others do. I would say that's probably what dictates it most of all.
Bernie?
Are any of the Prairie Dog dollars involved in this? Is that new program?
Not currently. So our current infrastructure funding policy is what we use to look ahead on what those cost splits would be. That's our current policy. So that's what we're using.
So looking at the one slide there on the past history, it talks about, I think it's 15, 16, 17, 18, or 16, 17, 18, where it jumped 15, 20 million. Is that because of the 50-50 split? Is that where that 50-50 split versus the 70-30 split comes into play? I.e., what were the years where we were on a 50-50 split versus the 70-30?
So I think here you're talking about the 16, 17, 18.
Correct.
Yes, it would have been the former infrastructure funding policy. I think part of the reason why we saw a spike in some of those years too is we had the HMGP grant that we're following that allowed us to do more work. But it did ultimately increase the amount special assessed, as there was a portion of that wasn't funded by the HMGP grant as well.
Commissioner Garrick.
So on this slide, and for everyone, it's page 7, the first slide, the 15.1 on average, that's the amount that I'm trying to look to replace with a different way of doing without special assessments. That's the amount of the existing infrastructure that gets replaced. If you're a homeowner in an established neighborhood and they're redoing your road in front of your house or a main or something like that, that 15 million represents the special assessments that you're used to seeing, right? So Bernie mentioned it already, and you'll hear about it more, the Prairie Dog bill, you'll hear this, but we're expecting to bring in $13+ million per year from that. And that's assuming that oil is at $40 a barrel. Today, oil is at $63. So if it stays that way, there you go. If it stays that way, we expect 50% more than $13 million, okay? So if you're looking at $18 million, give or take, or 19, that's more than the average that we're seeing here. And that's how that Prairie Dog can help replace special assessments for the average person. Now, if you want to go further and you want more dollars on that, then you throw the utilities on and the other things we've talked about on top of that, and then you have the more dollars that you need. So that's why I want to drive home is that first column. That's why they broke it out the way they did. That's the existing infrastructure that we're used to talking about versus new stuff like new whatever arterial roads that they're talking about here and greenfield expansion. I just want to make that clear.
On that. Kurt? So still back to that number, you have 3 years where it was assessed at 50-50 versus the 70-30. Is that correct? The 16, 17, and 18 where it's 21, 24, 23 versus the 7, 9, and 4. So
I'll answer what I believe is correct, and Dan can correct me if I'm wrong.
There you go.
So how this was compiled was based on the policy at the time So when we reverted back, those numbers would have been brought down. However, at the time of the approved CIP, that was the amount to be special assessed as part of those street recon and rehab projects. Commission took an action, reverted back to that old policy, and that was the sum of money that we had to come up with to buy down that portion, but that's not reflected in this table. This table is really what was approved at the time of those special assessments. Is that right? Correct. Okay. Right, yeah, so what was actually assessed would be based on the current infrastructure funding policy, which is the 2013 policy that we reverted back to.
I guess where I was going with that is, I think Tony's number is less at the 70-30 split. You're not making up 15 million at that point.
Really what would happen is that would still be the shortfall, because as we reverted back in that policy, the city funds had to increase. So I think this does accurately reflect the amount that would have to be, if it was utility funds, if it was prairie dog, whatever it was, this accurately reflects the additional versus what's currently being funded through city funds.
So where were the funds coming from before? If you were spending that amount of money on projects, what bucket were they coming out of previously?
Special assessments. So then when the policy changed, then the city, I think it was about $15 million that the city then had to fund that was previously special assessments. And so that's the reason why we are not doing any water main replacement projects this year. That was one of the big reasons why we dropped those, to try to fund that shortfall.
Further questions? Jeff?
Same slide, question on, again, that first comment. So that would include sewer and water replacement projects with the street. It's all in there.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
So again, this doesn't show any city funds. It shows what was intended to be special assessed based on that infrastructure funding policy at the time.
Kurt?
I've got another question regarding how you come to the design. For instance, I've seen around town, specifically down by South High, where we went from having 1 or 2 streetlights on a block to basically having one every other house almost, at a cost of $2,000-ish per home. How does that get determined? Why do we go to that extreme, go from one extreme to the other? I believe the design drives cost in most cases here.
So as far as, I don't know that I can address exactly the street lighting question. I know when we're evaluating and replacing and putting in new streetlights, they're looking at the luminaires from the light, and they're looking at the standards. So I do know that they're trying to meet a standard when they're reevaluating and reconstructing and re-putting those lights in. So I do know that they look at the spread of the luminaires, and that's determining the spacing. So you're correct. When we do a water main replacement project, typically there might have been one at every corner, and then when the new lights go in, there's typically more. And so they're about same spacing as what we'll see in a new development. In regards to the design, we try, especially in the new developments, we try and go through our corridor studies and what can we do to try and, what type road needs to go in, those types of things. And so that's where we do come to back to our commission to try and see, okay, how would you like us to proceed? So we know there's anticipated growth. Do we want to put in those additional lanes up front? Do we want to add those in later? Do we want to control the cost today? Those are the processes that we go through on some of those arterial roads.
the CIP plan that you guys provided last year when we were getting started talked about having road life of 63 years, I think it says on average, when you combine the asphalt and concrete. It averages out to 63 years. How many streets in Fargo actually make it that long?
I would say it really depends. So that number was trying to take a guess at what the life should be based on typical maintenance and pavement preservation projects throughout the life of the project. So honestly, I think those numbers were conservative as far as what we hope to get out of those. An arterial is going to make it 30 years. 30 to 35 years is pretty typical for an arterial roadway. A local concrete, we do have local concrete roads that are 80 years old out there. They're in very poor shape. Concrete gets to a condition where it's poor and it stays poor for quite a long time. So we do have some very old concrete roads out there that probably meet that 80-year life, but again, you swing to an arterial, it's probably going to be closer to 30 years. So it really depends. Again, asphalt roadway, we'd be happy to see a 50-year life. There are some roads where we do see that with mill and overlays, seal coats, crack fills, those types of preventative maintenance. We do see that type of life. And there are others that were paved at a time where the city did the best that they could, knowing what they knew. Didn't put in drain tile, didn't put in gravel. It was paved straight on clay. Those aren't going to make a 50-year life. So the roads we're building now, we do believe are going to make a 50-year life. But again, it's all about pavement preservation. So it's an average. Some are going to make it, some aren't.
I was just curious if we actually had a map that demonstrates what that is.
We do have that information in a pavement management software, yes.
Bill?
Along that same line, a question, do you factor in a case where you have a street that you're looking at that particular longevity on that gets ripped up for some other reason in the meantime, with several years of usability left in that street? Is that taken into consideration anywhere?
Yes. So we have some roads this year that we are trying to figure out what to do. That they were paved, they were overlaid in a time where our assessment policy, I think, was a 25-year assessment for the mill and overlay. And unfortunately, the condition of those roads, they're not going to make it the full 25 years. We'll maybe make 18 years out of it before we have to go back in there. And we do have a practice, and Dan can maybe speak to that a little bit more about what we do when we did special assess them. Some of those situations we work with Public Works, and Public Works goes in there and does a thin overlay to buy us those extra 7 years until we get to the end of our special assessment term. Likewise, there are some other projects like Broadway. We had done a mill and overlay project up by your house, Bill. And then we had another project that came up, the force main, and following the HMGP grant money. It was a prime project for reconstruction. So what the city did was credit back the balance of the remaining special assessments for that mill and overlay project. So Dan might be able to speak to that more, but that's typically the standard. If there's a reason why we have to go into that project early, then we credit back the existing special assessments on the previous project.
Okay.
Additional questions? Brenda, you have additional points to make, or are you?
Nope.
Ready to move to the next agenda item? Okay, we'll proceed. Mr. Grubb?
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and task force members. Obviously, the legislative session has ended now, and there were some bills that were approved that could potentially impact the work that the task force is doing here. And I'll start out in numerical order going through a number of bills, but most notably, it's been referenced this morning already, is House Bill 1066, which is otherwise known as the Prairie Dog Bill. And That bill establishes something new called a municipal infrastructure fund, and the bill directs a portion of oil and gas production tax revenues to that fund. In the bill, the Municipal Infrastructure Fund is a fund for providing infrastructure grants to cities in non-oil producing counties. And so that obviously includes the cities of Fargo and West Fargo. The grants can only be used for essential infrastructure, which is defined in the bill further, but certainly includes the type of infrastructure that the task force is discussing now: water, sanitary sewer, storm sewer, and streets. There is a formula established in the bill that determines the amount of grant money that cities will receive, and that formula is based on several factors. There are 4 of them. There's a base amount based on population. There's a second population factor based on a per person amount applied. There is a population growth factor included in the formula, and then finally a valuation change factor as well. So that really is a difference maker, I think, for cities like Fargo. Be a lot of debate on how to apply that, but it's really exciting that that becomes available. To our knowledge, it sounds like the first time that money, to some degree, will become available is in October of 2020, and so that bill was approved by the House and the Senate and has been signed by the governor.
Bruce, just to clarify a point, with this program, there's also a certain dollar amount cap, what the legislature provided. So it doesn't matter if it's $40 oil or $60 oil. If oil goes to $80, we don't get more money.
That's the way I understand it, yes. The buckets will fill despite what, there is, the important number is that bottom number, but as long as it's above that number, it will be a consistent distribution to cities and non-oil producing counties, yeah. So, thank you. And then some others I'd just like to go through quickly because they, some of them failed, some passed. But House Bill 1307 was a bill that would have limited the special assessment benefit that gets applied to a property not to exceed what the bill called the special benefit. And in the bill, special benefit was defined as the increase in market value to the property due to the improvements. And so that bill did not make it out of the House, but it was introduced, and so that was something something new that we haven't seen before. House Bill 1474, this was an interesting one because this is a bill that would have given cities the ability to levy an infrastructure property tax in lieu of special assessments. It's important to note that that bill also required that that be approved by a public vote and required a supermajority, 60% of the voters to be approved. But ultimately, that bill got changed to a study. That study bill was approved in both the House and the Senate, and in the interim, that study work will be being done. And then House Bill 1488, that was a bill that would have required an annual review of all special assessment revenues, and if the revenues were sufficient to pay off the bonds, no further collection of special assessments would be allowed. They'd have to stop. That bill did pass in the House but failed in the Senate. Senate Bill 2020 was a big one. That's the State Water Commission funding bill, statewide funding for water projects. That bill included funding for some big ones around here, FM Diversion Project and Red River Valley Water Supply Project. That bill was approved by both the House and the Senate. Senate Bill 2040 was a lesser bill, kind of an interesting one though. It's related to special assessment districts and how property owned by a political subdivision within that district is treated in terms of protests. So property owned by a political subdivision like Fargo cannot be included in the protest calculation unless we're protesting the very district that we're trying to establish. And so then it can be included in the calculation, and that bill was approved by both the House and the Senate. And then finally, Senate Bill 2275, which was a bill to basically replace the current Bank of North Dakota Infrastructure Revolving Loan Fund, increasing the loan limits from $15 million to $25 million per entity. That came with a 30-year 2%, 30-year loan term, 2% interest. What was interesting about that bill, it did also include a provision for flood control, water supply, and water management projects that would have included a 40-year loan term at 2%. So that bill was passed in the Senate, but it failed in the House. And so with Brenda's presentation this morning, she passed out, I believe, a copy of the Prairie Dog bill, the big one. The other two that passed, I have copies, lesser bills. If you're interested, I'd be happy to provide those to you on the way out. But with that, Mr. Chairman, that concludes my legislative report.
Kurt?
When we reviewed the Bismarck requirements before, they were talking about going back and changing a bill. The clause in there didn't allow them to use infrastructure, or what, I forget what it was exactly.
Which bill are you referencing?
I don't remember which one it was.
Was it a bill or was it a local proposed order?
No, it was at the state level.
Friend of mine.
Curtis, that is the one that you had talked about, the street utility fee. That's the one they had tried to.
Failed.
Yeah.
Okay.
That
one's in a study.
That
correct?
one got changed to a study and was approved by both the House and the Senate. So those are the type of things that I assume that study effort will be looking at, yeah.
Further comments, questions? Jeff?
Bruce, was that the bill that Bismarck was pushing to match with
Yes, sir.
their?
Yes, sir.
Now it helps me understand.
Maybe if I can.
Can you?
The 2275 was what they called Prairie Dog 2, I believe, right? It failed. Did not some of that money get rolled into another revolving loan fund?
Yeah, a number of things happened. That bill was attempted to be brought back under House Bill 1014. That was not successful. Heard that it was included near the end as part of the OMB bill. That failed as well, and so at the final hour, the number adjustment, maybe 15 to 25, was 15 to 30. I don't have those details, but that longer-term low-interest loan we're still working on.
Okay, we'll move along. Thank you, Bruce. If I could have this slide, I saw it up earlier on our screens. Might be a little easier to read for folks. And just to review, the recommended next steps is to reach consensus on the summary of the survey that you participated in earlier this year, and then take that information and present to local public forums. So this one is easier to read. This is a summary of the choices: strongly agree, strongly disagree, disagree, agree, and neutral, and those items that were part of the survey. And so I'll open it up for your wishes on how to move forward. Jeff?
Mr. Chairman, it was an interesting way to sort out the results of the survey. And I think it became clear to me in looking at it that the consensus of the task force is that we need to continue with specials, figure out how maybe to communicate better. When you look at that top green bar that jumped out loud and clear, that's a challenge. I think it also became clear, as I said, that the city should continue to use special assessments in some fashion to develop infrastructure, and that infrastructure development should not be minimized or reduced, that it's, and I think that's critical, that we not use this as a way to degrade or allow the infrastructure to degrade in the city. Where it becomes a little less clear where we stand is kind of in the details of where do we go with it. But I think we need to move forward with the presumption that we want to preserve specials and make it a better system as best we can flush out what that looks like. I think we're going to need to dig a little deeper into some of the pieces. How do we do that, right? One of the things that I don't think we've ever talked about as a task force is what is a reasonable special assessment? I keep hearing they're too high, but I don't think I've ever heard a conversation of what's reasonable. What's the number that makes it too high, right? And that could be a long conversation and obviously different opinions, but I don't think we're going to be able to finish concluding some of these things. If that's the mindset that we need to reduce special assessments, then if that's our goal, we need to know what we're reducing it to and what the pieces that make it up. Otherwise, we'll never finish that conversation. So I don't know that we want to go there. I don't think I'm suggesting it, but I think we need to keep that in mind as we talk through solutions. If that's where we go, we got to be prepared for that conversation. We probably can come forward with some recommendations without getting that deep into weeds of what's an answer for specials, but what are some things that can move the needle up and down, and that kind of came out in the survey. You know, can we do some things that reduce the costs? I'm a little concerned that this task force not be thinking we need to come up with alternative funding schemes. I think our order would be to identify if we think we should change systems, what the cost of new money needs to be. Okay, so if we're going to try to reduce the costs of infrastructure through specials, what might that cost be and where, and then the city needs to figure out what's the funding source, because I don't think we came together to say we should increase utility bills, we should increase sales tax, we should increase other revenue streams. I don't think that was our task. I think it was more, how do we manage specials? Where do we, you know, what do we think we can recommend to the city to make it more palatable and maybe more understanding to the public, if that makes sense. I'm uncomfortable telling the city they should increase a fee, but I think it's our obligation to try to identify what is not being paid for if we think we want to take it out of specials, to come to some reasonable number of cost of specials. So, you know, I'd like to see us move forward with pieces of this and see if we can get some answers. For example, I think we need to have a separate conversation and some consensus on when I look at those, what happens at the end of a bond issue? Okay, where does that money go? How is it managed? I think that's a separate conversation on should we assess sidewalks? Should we assess, right, what is it we should assess? I think those are two separate conversations, and we should have it and come to some conclusion to help move decisions on what we're doing here. But I think this should be helpful in that we not get too distracted with the things that appear obvious that we're agreeing on, and try to get into the conversation. What are the pieces we need to chew on a little more, and see if we can come out with some recommendations.
Kurt?
I agree with what you're saying, but I don't necessarily agree that what we as a group, our survey, I don't believe reflects what the general public is asking, and this is why. Bernie's summary for West Fargo says the consensus from the public is to get rid of specials. Bismarck's getting rid of specials. Everything I hear from all the people I talk to at work and around the community is get rid of specials. We had a gentleman, I believe he's still in the audience today, said to get rid of specials. So I think we need to, as a committee or task force, at least propose one option and present that to the forums that Tony's talking about that does that. I'm not exactly sure how we get there, but I think there's a combination available, at least for part of it, to take what Tony Garrick is saying and shift some of that money around, with the Prairie Dog Fund, you could most likely match that $15 million pretty easily. I believe as a group, we have to have an option where that's the case. Because the feedback I'm hearing from the public and seeing in the community is they want them to go away.
Kevin?
I'd agree with Kurt. I think at a minimum, this committee should at least have, I'd like to see us have 3 or 4 options. And I think, to Jeff's point, I think there can certainly be an option that it's more as is, but with better transparency, better buy-in, better input from citizens, understanding. Even going through the tables today, it's like, how would you understand how this process works? It's confusing at best. So I think that would be one option. I do think we need to have an option. I still have a concern for those that are living on a fixed income, that have been their homes for 30, 40 years. They're trying to make it by, Jeff, great question, what's that amount? I can tell you that the customers that we work with, $10, $15 is too much if you're on a fixed income. And so I would like to see us have, 3 or 4 options where we kind of lay out saying, here's an option where we kind of keep it the same, better transparency. Another option is we separate the new development from the existing. We come up with a plan where it is some type of a utility fee as an option. I do understand that specials aren't going to go away. Somebody's got to pay for it, that there is no free lunch. So it's a mechanism. And I would just like to see us have some type of an option for those existing homeowners about how can we create some type of a plan where they can pay some type of I know what my bill is going to be. I know when I'm in my house, I'm not going to get shocked or surprised. I've got this covered. The new development, I think that when you're buying a house, you understand better. You're buying something. You make the decision if you want to get into and pay these kind of specials. I think there can be a separate from those two. That's kind of how I'd see it. At least having those options, and so we can have that dialogue with the general public.
John?
Excuse me. I think we're back here again. Jeff, I agree with what you're saying, and the disagreement to specials is people don't understand what they're tied to. And Kurt, when I get those questions, that nobody likes special assessments, but if you back up and tie it to the benefit and say, well, do you want potholes? Do you want water main breaks in your yard? So I think we need to be careful here that we understand that there's a cost to this and we have to pay it. And we can have a discussion about priorities and the quality or all those things, but there is an underlying cost. And so if we if we do away with special assessments, what are we going to replace it with? How are we going to pay for it? And if all we're doing is shifting and saying, okay, homeowners don't like special assessments, let's move to sales tax, let's move to income tax, let's move to whatever other tax there might be, we haven't done anything. We've just shifted money around. And that's what I think we need to address here.
I would contend that the streets are used by many, many people that come from out of town, especially the arteliers and the connection ones. We have people in here all the time for monster hockey tournaments, for concerts, for all kinds of things. Come from all over, Minnesota and North Dakota both. And by converting to a sales tax base, you're picking up the infrastructure costs that they're causing.
And we do that now.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying I think we should do it more.
I don't disagree, but I also go to other cities and use their infrastructure. And again, what we're talking about is how we pay for it. And you have to be careful. The reason I like special assessments, I'm probably one of the few people in the world, other than my friend Jeff here, it has to directly show benefit to a property. You have to be able to draw that direct line. You can't special assess something that doesn't benefit the underlying property. Now, if that happens or not, that's another discussion. if we go and step further back from the project to how we pay for it, it becomes more obscure, and you don't recognize what's happening, what are you paying for in those projects. And so sales tax are nice, and it's always nice to shift burdens, but at the end of the day, we're the people that are going to pay for it. We have to pay for our infrastructure, and we certainly don't want to get into a situation where we limit our finance options, which drives our infrastructure decisions, which causes deferred maintenance and leads us into a real big problem somewhere in the future.
And I guess my thought at this point, though, I don't think we're trying to make the final decision. I think what we're trying to do is to present to the public saying, here's some different options, and get the feedback so that we can provide the city with here's some feedback, here's some options. Whether you agree with a utility fee or just leaving it as is with other infrastructure, I think those should at least be presented saying, here's some options at this point. And not to have 10 options, because I think that's going to be overwhelming, but to have 2 or 3 options where you say, here's 2 or 3 options, what's your feedback, so that we can make a better decision.
Yeah.
Why is Fargo so fundamentally different in West Fargo that we have to have specials versus the rest of the country? I understand on new projects, the greenfield projects in other communities, the developer takes on the risk, and those aren't city specialed. But in the rehab projects, the reconstruction projects, it doesn't seem anywhere else in the country, or very few places in the country have specials. Why is Fargo so different that we have them?
I believe there are specials throughout the United States, throughout all of those, and I think that's one of the misnomers. We do new development with specials, which is unique, but even in those cities where the developer pays for the infrastructure, when that infrastructure wears out, there has to be special assessments back to the property to replace it. And I go back to the example I made before. I have rural property, and when my well quits, I pay to repair it. I don't go back to the contractor that 20 years ago put my well in and say, hey, it quit, come on out and fix it. And so whether or not the city does greenfields or not, there's still going to be special assessments. We're still going to have to pay that. Or, as Kurt's suggesting, if we don't have special assessments, we'll have to have a 6, 7, 8, 9% sales tax or some other tax to raise those funds to pay for it. And so specials, I think, take the brunt of, I don't want specials. And I'm the first one when I open that envelope and go, oh, wow, another street light or traffic signal. I don't want that traffic signal. I don't use that street. Well, if that's our mentality across the whole city, then nobody's going to pay for those things.
I'll look to Dan maybe to come up and comment on that as well. And you could address that. I know in Sioux Falls, I believe they title it impact fees versus special assessments. So do you have any additional comments you could add, Dan, to Kent's question?
Throughout the year, we typically field some comments from other communities, other states. Most states do have some kind of special assessment for their reconstruction. They don't, we are correct in saying we are unique in the fact that we do special assess our greenfields. But they're Minnesota, South Dakota, they use impact, some places use impact fees. And we find out through conversations that impact fees aren't covering. So they've actually called us to say, what do we do? Don't know. We use special assessments. Do they increase their taxes? Do they increase their impact fees? How do you go back and recharge an impact fee that's charged at the onset for the future reconstruction?
If I could, my opinion, Kent, the reason that it's here is because it's working. What we got to figure out is how to make it work better. I look at our metro and think we have a lot of things figured out other metros don't. And And I'm just concerned that we don't try to turn this dial so hard, so fast, that it screws up what we got going for us. I think another general conclusion I got, no tax is fair. And really what this conversation is, how do you make it reasonable and as fair as you can, right? No one tax is fair. Sales tax isn't fair. Property taxes aren't fair. Special assessments, you could argue, aren't fair, because I hear that argument. None of it's fair in any one person's mind, right? But collectively, we got to take care of the community. We got to build a community, and infrastructure is a critical part of building a community. You know, if you will, let your street in front of you house go to nothing and sell your house. Did its value go down? Absolutely. Try to sell it. So that's what I think, kind of to John's point, special assessments in my mind are very valuable because it connects the cost to the benefit. Now, we can debate how much you should special. That's what I think the discussion should be. Should we assess the cost to build the berm around the subdivision with the subdivision? And I don't even know what we're all specialing anymore, right? I think that becomes the conversation, but we better not get rid of the basics. We better not eliminate putting sewer, water, streets so that people can live in their houses and sell their houses. And those connections, I think, are critical why specials work. You can argue that it needs to be tweaked a little bit. I get it, but I really struggle with the concept of eliminating it because infrastructure is what drives our economy. And we better not take our eye off of that. And we quickly can change how it gets looked at and built if we try to turn a hard dial and all of a sudden take a complete funding source off the table. It's not going to work. It's going to put us in a bad spot. And so we got to, as unfair as they all are, we got to feel comfortable talking about the unfairness of it and see if we can figure out a way to make it palatable and work. I think there's some real highlight. I think education is a problem. I think it maybe became a little too easy to just throw things in on specials. And I think that became part of the creeping of the costs. You know, what are we specialing? I think that's what we need to talk about because there are some critical things that should not come off the table, in my opinion.
Kurt?
We call them specials, but there's really nothing special about them. It's a standard operating procedure. We do it day in, day out, day in, day out. I believe the original intent was specials. This is just my belief that for certain instances, when you needed additional funding, you use a special. I'm not proposing we take that off the table. And I think there's a use for those, but they need to be under special circumstances, not your daily operation. Your daily operation should be set up so you don't have to do that.
But that funding needs to come from somewhere.
Right. I'm suggesting it comes from a different source than out of every homeowner's pocket because the cost-benefit analysis, if it was actually done for what a person's getting charged for their benefit to their house, it doesn't match. If I got have 100, Bill, you're gonna have to help me here. I don't know what your house is worth. Say it's $150,000. Some of those houses in that neighborhood are at that range. I had heard that they were in the tune of $25,000 of special assessment. Somewhere there, or more.
Yeah, the bigger lot down on 19th Avenue and Broadway was about 28,000 just because it was a larger lot. But as a general rule, up and down that street, on that side of the street, they were probably in the 15,000 and up bracket.
Under the old policy.
Under the 50-50 policy. So at that point, the city made a decision to change that back to 70-30, which was a good decision. But I don't think it should stop there either. I think as far as specials are concerned, whatever you call them, as a task force, currently, we aren't in agreement or a consensus of what to do with the details. We need to be.
Dan, follow up on Kurt's comment?
They were under the old, under the 50/50 policy, that was a jump. But remember, it was still 50/50, 50% city participation, 50% special assessed to the owner. Kurt talks about the cost benefit analysis, and that works out in the cost of construction. It works out, each project is a cost benefit analysis in and of itself. We infuse money to skew that to one side, to the cost benefit of the resident. The construction cost is what it is. We know that. We do it by statute, so we know what that policy is. In Mr. Worth's position, we went back, we looked, we knew 50/50 was too high because of the outcry. So we came back to the old policy, we did other things. We credited back the mill and overlay we did in that area. Our policy was set at a 40-foot equivalent roadway. In this case, it was a 36-foot roadway. We pulled back to the 36-foot roadway. So we did everything we possibly could to drive down that, bring back that cost, and bring it into alignment. It is going to be your decision or your recommendations to define that. We take our policy, we apply it, and that's what we do. We brought it back to, we call it a 70-30, but it was actually a cap.
When I did the math on that, I believe even if it was $25,000 at 50/50, if you did a 70-30, assuming I did my math correctly, it would still be about $10,000.
Correct. But that's based on the cost of construction.
Right, but I don't believe the house value went up $10,000 because the street was redone.
But when you do the analysis for specials, it has nothing to do with the value of the home. That's off the table. It's the value of the construction to the lot. We do not value what's on the lot. It could be a barren lot. It's the benefit analysis to the lot, not what's on the lot, and not the value of the lot.
Ernie?
And to Dan's point, when we did our special assessment forms, that's exactly the most difficult thing there is, to communicate and educate those folks that were attending the forms, is because their natural assumption is that their valuation is going to go up $10,000 if there's a $10,000 benefit, and that's where the serious discussions then start to take place. Dan's absolutely right, and that's what the public had trouble wrapping their head around it.
Jeff or John?
Back to Jeff's point, though, is that if you can't get to the house, can you sell it? And again, the specific example, would you have not have them do those improvements? Would you rather they left the road, they left the sewer, they left the water in the condition that it currently was? Or did you want that to be replaced?
I would argue the value goes down. If you don't do it, it would probably go down by that amount. If you don't replace the street, if you don't replace the sewer lines, obviously you're taking value away from those properties. So, and we do look at that when we do our market analysis for properties. We look at the specials, we look at what's been done, and compare the specials from one house to the other.
Kevin?
Well, and again, I don't think anybody's suggesting, I think we all strongly disagree that infrastructure should not be replaced. I think it's how do we fund it. If you look at your homeowner's insurance, you pay a flat fee for your homeowner's insurance because you don't want to have, and to your question, if my roof gets damaged, I should pay for my roof. But we all pay together, and we create a pool of funds to replace our roofs, to have our house burns down. And so what I'm suggesting is that, not that we should never, and I think we all agree on that, the streets need to be fixed up, they need to be replaced. But do we create a funding mechanism that's for those individuals that are living in fixed incomes, living in their homes, There's no surprise for it. We're all paying it. I would never suggest that we get rid of them. Is how do we pay for it? How do we get rid of the surprises, the special, and so that it is more of a budgeting tool for people to be able to know, I know for the next 5 years what my payment's going to be, my street's going to be fixed up, it's going to be repaired, and I think the new is a separate issue because that's just a different concept. But if I'm living in my house, I kind of want to know what I'm going to be looking at for my budget.
Yeah.
So as I'm listening to some of the conversation about the North Broadway project, it still for me, it comes back to the question, what is fair? What should have been the right answer? And, you know, a lot of times when I get into conversation about trying to solve problems, what I experience, if you will, let's say the problem is this big of an area, and we tend to concentrate on the oddball on the outside and just put all our energy into fixing that oddball on either end of the extreme, instead of put the conversation in the middle of how do we fix the middle and then deal with the oddball. But if you try to solve the problem by dealing with the oddball first, you're just gonna run yourself ragged. Because in my experience, you can't solve the problem by trying to start with the extreme. I get it, may be $100,000 was too much for a special. That may be, but what about the other, I don't know how many were on that list, hundreds? What about the 90% that seem to work? And can we tool that maybe, make that a little better, then ask the question, do we still have an oddball that we need to solve a problem for? But I think we're using the extreme conditions to try to change the entire system. And I think that's problematic. That's not how you make good decisions to implement change. And that becomes the mantra, is that oddball number for one or two pieces of property that tend to drive the rest of the conversation. And I think we got to get away from that. Know it's out there, but you don't solve that one first. You solve that one last. And deal with, can we make the 90% that seem to be working right even a little better? And it's going to migrate the discussion in a direction that oddball becomes less problematic to solve. That becomes the challenge I think we have. And to get it, we all have different opinions. I'm still a little unclear on what it is we can come up with for alternative solutions unless we're talking the entire infrastructure system and come up with 3 or 4 plans to build infrastructure. That's a mammoth task, and I don't think we're going to do that in a short period of time. I'm a little unclear what that looks like in our coming up with a recommendation. I appreciate the comment that the public, there are people in the public that still say, let's eliminate specials completely. I get it. I look at this and say, this is the opinion of those of us sitting at the table. And at the end, are we going to come up with a recommendation that this task force thinks is right? Or are we challenged with going out and doing a public investigation and coming back with a public survey type result? That's 2 completely different things, right?
Aren't we here, though, to serve the public?
I understand.
And the city's here to serve the public. So
but
we should have some of their opinion in this.
Well, I get it. We need their opinion, but at the end of the day, there's, 9 or 10 of us on the task force that need to make a decision and make a recommendation moving forward. And so we all come with a perception of what the public is telling us. I get that, but at the end, this group has got to decide what we think is right. Otherwise, we might as well do some public survey and let that be the answer. And I don't think we have an education system adequate to tell the public how specials work. I think that's the biggest problem we have. It's the very top one. We all strongly agree. I think that's the biggest problem, is we don't know how to educate on the whys and the hows special assessments work. I think that's our, if we could solve that problem, most of what I hear, I think, would be better understood, and that would be a huge, huge benefit we could bring to the public. is help to develop or help to recommend an education process.
Tom, did you have a comment?
What's the acceptable price for an improvement is very difficult to define, but I just want to give an example. So a couple projects come to mind. Dan and I have had many conversations with property owners at our property owner meetings that we have prior to construction. A lot of discussion about special assessments and what they're getting for what they're paying. A very good example is a project we did just last year, just north of I-94, east of Nativity Church. We did a project just west of there, it adjoins the streets adjoin in that area. We did a project in 2014, and those special assessments it was under our 13 policy, and they were about $10,000 to $12,000 per property. We went to that public meeting last year for the project that we were doing in 2018, and under our current policy at that time, the special assessments were estimated to be $25,000 to $30,000. And we had some very good conversation at that meeting. I think we were there for an hour to an hour and a half discussing with those residents. And ultimately, here's what I feel I heard throughout that, is that if you were special assessing us $10,000 to $12,000 for new sewer, new water, new streets, new streetlights, we'd say, okay, that seems like a fair number to us. $25,000 to $30,000 doesn't. And that's what we got. And I think many on that project were vocal with our commission as well. And that's one of the reasons our commission took the action to revert back to the 2013 policy. Another thing I'd add is that we do hear some complaints on, say, arterial construction, but really not many. For the thousands of properties we might touch on an arterial project, most people are not complaining about a $2,000 assessment over 25 years. There are some that do, and I think we'll have that at any dollar value, but we don't hear much on that very often. Likewise, with the mill and overlay, we rarely hear anything. So I think there are some values, and some people see a benefit for, and they can accept that. It is always a shock when you get a $10,000, $12,000 bill in the mail, though. There's no doubt in that. But through our conversations, I think most people do typically start to understand. But like you said, it's a very complicated. Think of the number of meetings that we've had to get to this point, and to try to become educated about special assessments. They're confusing because they're complicated, right? There is a lot of detail. There's a lot of detail we go into through our policy, and to be sure that we're special assessing a benefit to those that are benefiting. What I've found is that the only way you can really get someone to understand special assessments is probably a half an hour to an hour long conversation, one-on-one conversation. We've struggled with that, is how do we better educate? And that's the issue. Is I don't know how, but I think that is what the issue is how do we educate what we are doing and what's potentially coming. Hope that helps a little bit.
Kurt?
I just did the math quick on that $10,000. That's $33 a month. I would personally rather not pay the city that extra % of interest and just pay that bill every month, because it's going to be there. That's over the 25 years that the city is currently assessing. Instead of getting that $10,000 bill, and then it gives you a heart attack, even though it is only $33 a month, if you choose not to pay it.
Gloria?
I think the biggest issue is cost, always is cost. And when we look at the infrastructure cost compared to the price of the home, in the greenfields in particular, has gone up so much as a percentage of the cost of the home compared to 10 years ago. And I understand costs have gone up, and labor has gone up, construction costs have gone up, but is there anything we can do to try to drive some of that cost out in some way? I don't know regional bidding places for contractors, something that competition always drives costs down, and it just seems to have gone up so exponentially over the last several years. And I think that's where a lot of the complaint comes in. When you look at the price of a home, the cost of the infrastructure compared to what the homeowner is paying has percentage-wise gone up a lot. And we're all talking in our communities about affordable housing, and we do not have affordable housing available to first-time home buyers. It's very difficult.
Jeff?
If you will, to the cost, the cost went up dramatically when the Bakken boomed. All the contractors left town. Ask the engineering group, how many bids were we getting? Okay. That number went down dramatically. But today, how many bids are you getting now? 5 times as many on projects? Okay, the economy has changed, the nature of the bidding environment has changed dramatically in the last 3 years. It's going to change again. So I would challenge us, we can sit here all we want and talk about trying to drive costs one way or the other. It's the factors we cannot control. It is what it is. You can choose to throttle down how much you build when the competition goes down, and you can choose to drive up how much you do when the competition is there, right? So in today's market, we should be building, because the competition is severe right now. There's a lot of people out there needing work, okay? But that is something we can't, in my opinion, control how the regional economy is working. That is what it is. We just have to be prepared to deal with it, and can we make decisions as a community to take advantage? There's several, the time to build infrastructure is when the cost of money is down and the competition's up, okay? And that's the exact opposite some people in this task force want to hear, because it's going to add, but now's the time to catch up on infrastructure. Now, how we pay for all that, I get all that, but now's going to be one of the cheaper times to do it, because there are times when the cost of money goes up and the competition goes down, and both of those factors hit you at the same time. Those hurt, but there's still things you have to do when that happens, right? So, again, in my mind, we got to focus on the things we can control and understand the things you can't, and that's one you can't control, as far as what's the bidding environment.
Okay, I'm going to insert myself as chair here. Part one, because we're coming up on time, and part two, we need to move forward, not backwards. And in my opinion, there's a great discussion this morning. Many of the topics are in this list in some form or fashion. And I would suggest that we move forward with the data that we have that covers largely the conversation here today, determine how to put that into a presentation format, and under the title of options, we look what is available to us as far as under law, because it doesn't make any sense to propose an option that would be restricted by North Dakota Century Code. And so that would be my suggestion to move this forward, because we do have to move forward. Many of the things we've shared here today have been talked about in prior meetings, and they're listed in front of you. Now, some might not agree with the rankings because of how you voted, but that's the political process. Votes matter. And so we have to move forward to get to a point where we can come back, and we do need citizen involvement. We just need to do that. And so, again, I'm trying to get this, we started way out here, and now we're down here. We got to get to here to keep moving, because ultimately, we have to have recommendations to the city commission, and then that's another set of discussion and debate what to do. Because, you know, to make a substantive change, it's got to pass city commission in a new policy. That's the hardcore reality of what we're facing, what you're facing here today. We got to move forward.
So with that, can we agree that, and we've talked about this several times, that the greenfield should be done by the developers? Can we agree as a task force that the city should not be doing any of that the developer should pick that up.
I would disagree with that.
I would strenuously disagree with that in that the developers have that option right now. They do not have to use special assessments. And when you start talking about competition, and I tried to figure out why special assessments for greenfield development came in. It was when Fargo was a smaller growing community, and to put sewer and sidewalks and street in place required large outlays of money, and not a lot of developers in this area had that capability at that time. And so if you're going to remove special assessments from greenfields, you're probably going to reduce the number of developers that will have the capital necessary to get into developing raw land. And you might see, as Jeff has pointed out, a blowback from that that you didn't expect. And so as long as the developers have that option, if they feel that the city, using the city's method, is too expensive, they can go into the marketplace. There's nothing preventing them from doing that. I don't see that as a problem.
I would suggest the conversation should be what should be special assessed in the greenfield, and not go to no specials, but have the conversation. What should be assessed and what shouldn't? What becomes critical infrastructure? That's what you need to special assess, I think, because of the I'm going to use the word control the city has in its construction, because the city owns it at the end, right? City's going to operate and maintain it. So I think there's a value in that. Now, I don't know how much is getting special assessed. What are all the things that are getting put onto the assessment district? That's where I think the conversation should be, and figure out if we want to reduce the cost some, let's try to have that conversation. There may be some things the developer should pay for, and that's fine. We've not had that conversation. I don't know what the full list is. My suspicion is it's a lot longer today than it was 20 years ago. I think that's part of the problem. And it's not the fact that there are specials, it's we're adding so much to the list because it becomes easier to do it. And you know, that's where I think we need to go with this and figure out what's reasonable to have the city control what goes in, because they are responsible for it when it's done.
This would be a good segue into Bernie's report, comments from their efforts in West Fargo.
You're having a very interesting dynamic and discussion with particularly on the greenfields right now between Jeff and Kurt's comments. This is on city commissions, the elected officials, because we've allowed the policies to be a little broader. There's amenities that are being special assessed right now rather than critical infrastructure, to use the term that you did, Jeff. And that's a big discussion that we're having in West Fargo as to whether or not, you know, a security fence or amenities of a upgrade of lighting and things like that, because there are some developers that are bringing that forward, and the policy and the procedure has been to let them special assess it. But then the conversation goes on to the buying public for when Gloria gets involved, then all of a sudden the conversation, and I'm not inferring that the realtors are saying this, but it might be the bankers, it might be anybody and everybody are saying, well, there's so many special assessments in here, that's why the cost of the lot is X, and so those are the issues that you deal with. We have for you today our report on our special assessment forms. Now again, we did that differently than what our process is here. The process is here is that we've had a lot of discussion, and then we're going to go to the public and get their public input. We did the opposite. We went out and we had public forums. No city elected official participated in the discussion with our citizens. Only staff did. The experts, whether it was Jim Larson or Tina Fisk, our city administrator, our planning and zoning people, our economic development people, they each had a designated presentation that was consistent. And we also videotaped it and sent it out. if you look at some of the data that we collected on the pages in the back, you'll notice that we differentiated between the community forums that we had with people in person as well as what was online. There's that same survey, those rebroadcasts were out there. And part of that, the reason for that is we wanted a measurement of how effective, and this is a term that's been used numerous times this morning, is the educational process. You know, when we have city staff, whether it's Fargo, Moorhead, or West Fargo, whoever it is, these people are extremely good at what they do. But the policies are driven by the politicals. And so when they're asked to say, okay, figure out the cost of this, whether they use a square footage or whether they use a lineal footage, the public's perception and educational dynamics of what they understand are surprising. They really are. You know, how many times have you ever heard that you're trying to tax me out of my household? We see that online and social media and things like that. The reality of it is, earlier years, lots were bigger. And so now all of a sudden, because of the way we do our process, whether it's the term benefit or whatever, when you do a reconstruction, now all of a sudden those numbers are going up dramatically, whether it's by the square footage, by the lineal foot of how they assess that benefit. And the public really does not have a good understanding as to what that is. Because there's even times when we were in our meetings, would say, well, do you figure it by the square foot or do you figure it by the lineal foot? And even staff would have to say, well, there's times we do both, dependent upon the shape of the lot and those types of things. But, so we do have some conclusions. The conclusions that are on the first several pages here, the first 3 pages, are that of staff. That's of our experts. They have gleaned all of this information, all of the survey information that was taken both online and in our public forums. And again, there was our commission was totally and completely engaged. Our commissioners were at every meeting. And we had them on the north side, we had them on the south side, we had them in schools, we had them in businesses. So we really tried to facilitate in any way that we possibly could to get the public to join us. Of the 4 public hearings, we had over 150 people show up to those, which we were reasonably pleased with that. And then we had another engagement of online. But if you'll see some of the very discussions that we've had this morning are parallel to absolutely what our data research is. I would be willing to pay higher sales tax to fund infrastructure projects instead of special assessments. If you look at the graph, it's amazing what those responses are. Now, there is a certain element that when you have a public forum, you are going to get an element of the public that they have a bone to pick. They are there and they're angry and they want to talk to you about it. And that's all well and good. That's part of the process. You got to hear the good with the bad. But the thing that I really like to see is, I guess my pages aren't numbered, but it says, my knowledge of special assessment has increased because of this event and presentation. And those numbers were pretty good. Those that were strongly disagree with that were 1 and 2. There again, there's a factor there that they had an issue coming through the door of what they wanted to talk about. The other interesting thing is that the discussions that we had with the public forums wasn't only residential. We had a number of commercial people coming in with regard to special assessments too. And really online and by phone calls to the commission, we hadn't heard much from the commercial side, but they did come through the door when we had the public forums. So, Mr. Chairman, again, the recommendations are strictly by staff. We received this at Monday night. We had a special assessment special meeting. That's hard to say, John. And so these are recommendations from our staff. The commission is now going to digest this and come back with recommendations of how we might integrate their suggestions along with what the commission is thinking. I will tell you that, from a perspective of the amenities versus critical infrastructure, the commission is taking an extremely hard look at that. And the fact that if a developer comes in and you know, with a new plot, we're certainly going to continue to work with them on special assessments on green development. There's no question about that. There will be additional dialogue, though, on what those, what's going to be considered critical and what's going to be considered amenities. And the amenities, I think, will have a more difficult time, whether it's a, you know, a privacy fence or those types of things in berms. That, I believe, will be one of the major points of discussion there. In an attempt to keep the lot prices down, that if the developers want to have these amenities, because the way I look at it, there's times when some of these new developments are coming in, the developers are really competing against one another and what their offerings are and the look of that development. And should the city be getting engaged in that dialogue or that competition or those amenities? And it's the position of this one commissioner, we should not. So, and I know that several of my fellow commissioners feel the same way. But feel free to call either myself or Melissa Richard, excuse me, our communications director. She's the one that to put all of this together. If you have any questions on any of the data, we'd be happy to respond to anybody. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. 9 o'clock. So unless there's disagreement, I will work with staff to come up with a presentation that patterns the rankings. This is the baseline for our forms. Bring back that feedback, and we'll send that presentation before it's made to you electronically so that you have a chance to respond and give your feedback on how that will be presented. And obviously you'll be invited to those events as well, so it'll be full participation at your schedule, you know, deems appropriate. But we do need to move forward, and so, Christie?
Could I ask Mayor Dardis a question?
Sure.
So you mentioned that you had the public first before everybody got together as a task force. So if we bring our feelings to the community, how would that impact the public input? Are we...
One of my recommendations would be, and that's a great question, is the purpose of our public forums before was to try and raise the level of understanding and education, if you will, to our public as to what the public or what our policies have been with, you know, previous commissions and the existing commission, was to make facilitate them understanding what's being done now. Because all due respect, whether it's the members of this committee here or the public, they don't have the same perception that some of us have or some of the city commissioners from Fargo or West Fargo have as to what their knowledge is of how the special assessments are applied and how that cost benefit and how that all of that is. So I would highly recommend that if you go out into the public to have your public forums, that there be an educational element about this, about what the city of Fargo is doing presently, you know, and that's a difficult thing to go because there's going to be different levels of understanding of special assessments within your public. And so I personally believe that the most important part of what we did in our public forum was the educational element of raising their awareness, because there were numerous times, whether when we were on break or after the actual formal presentations, that people said, I had no idea that's how you did it. But yet they were there to, you know, to engage in the dialogue of special assessments. But they did not have a total clear understanding in many cases.
Mayor Mahoney.
I just want to make one quick comment to some of the conversations I've heard here today. A couple of elements you got to remember that in the last 5 years we had tremendous building, $1 billion in 1 year. We had evaluations go up 12-14%. We're back to 6 to 5%. We have seen specials come down in the bidding now, 10 to 15%. We're getting competition. That is happening. But truly, if you try to educate the public and then come up with the answer, I think the task to this committee is to come up with the answers. You have been educated in this for the last several months, and you should have some good ideas about it. And to your point, if we do a 70-30 split, if we got prairie dog funds and we can take more of the special cost, 80-20 split, you're going to take that $33 a month down to $20 a month. So you truly can make an impact. Prairie dog funds does help us, which you didn't have as a previous issue to do. Bernie's talking about sales tax in West Fargo. Can we use that? Can you use other elements? Well, you have a gift that's been given to you at the last legislative session, which we're going to get some prairie dog funding, which we also could put into specials. We also could debate arterials. Should arterials be given to you after you've been moved into a area? And I think Bernie's talking about that. When you add these extra things, can we handle arterials a little different? And could we handle streetlights? You know, so you move in, you're all settled down, and all of a sudden a streetlight comes up and you're assessed that. So I think you can look at different elements that the staff can highlight for you and say, here's some areas that we do get complaints about, we think we can make an impact. But I think your group, even when we go out to the community to show them, I think you guys have the fund and knowledge that Tony and Tony have been given to you. So you have the best advantage to give us advice. So I appreciate if you guys could kind of highlight that, tell us what you think we ought to do. So thank you.
Good point. I'll go to anyone have in the audience who like public comment. If so, take the podium.
I'm assuming this works, right?
Live.
Okay. Thank you for this opportunity to speak. I lived in Jefferson City, Missouri for 28 years in an older neighborhood and never, not once, paid a special assessment. It can be done. I just have one question. Why wasn't this task force more focused on eliminating completely special assessments? I think I know the answer. Powerful business entities in this town make their living on special assessments. Special assessments have become too easy for city government to inflict upon taxpayers, and I use the word inflict correctly. Something needs to be done to end this system and do what other cities have done. Instead of special assessments, other cities use property taxes, sales taxes, and other methods. Special assessments are unfair to senior citizens and need to be completely eliminated, or at least find a way to cut them in half. If property taxes instead of special assessments are used, the public will pay much more attention to the whole matter. If you can't eliminate special assessments, at least figure out a way to cut them in half, like a 90-10 split system. I would be personally willing to pay $20, maybe $30 a month to keep the city away from my nursing home money. Thank you.
Thank you. Any additional comments from the audience? Additional comments, directives from the task force? And my prior comments is how we'll proceed. And the community forums, public forums will also include education element as well, which is very important, I think, to Christie's question and West Fargo's process. And is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Thank you for your work and commitment to seeing this through.